Dry Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1878. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Dry Creek, a town where hope came to die and dreams withered like unwatered flowers. At 25, Dillon Matthews had already accepted that life on the frontier offered only two certainties: hard work and eventual disappointment. Love was a luxury afforded to those back east, where women wore perfume instead of gun belts and men could afford to be gentle. The West demanded vigilance, strength, and above all, emotional detachment. "No point getting attached to anything out here," Dillon muttered to himself as he guided his chestnut stallion through town. His lean frame sat easy in the saddle, young muscles hardened by years of ranch work. The shadow from his wide-brimmed hat couldn't hide the sharp angles of his face or the wariness in his blue eyes. At his hip, a Colt revolver rested in its holster, not for show, but necessity. 3 years on his own small cattle spread had taught Dillon that survival required focus. The men who dreamed of love were the ones who ended up with arrows in their backs or bullets in their chests, distracted by thoughts of soft lips when they should have been watching the horizon. His father had been such a man, pining for Dillon's mother even years after consumption had taken her, until Comanche raiders caught him daydreaming and left young Dillon orphaned at 16. The lesson had been seared into him. Attachment was weakness, weakness got you killed. "Matthews," Sheriff Holloway called from the boardwalk, "heard you're hiring hands for the spring drive." Dillon reined his horse to a stop. "Looking for 2 good men who know cattle and can shoot straight. Might be your lucky day. Stage is coming in with some folk looking for work, due any minute." Dillon nodded his thanks and guided his horse toward the stage depot. His ranch was finally turning a profit, small though it was. With 30 head ready for market, he needed help driving them to Cheyenne. Just business, the only relationship a smart man cultivated out here. The distant rumble of the stagecoach drew every idle eye in town. In a place like Dry Creek, the weekly stage was the closest thing to entertainment. Dillon dismounted and tethered his horse to the hitching post, leaning against a post to watch the arrival with practiced disinterest. The stage rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust, and the driver called down, "Mail and 3 passengers for Dry Creek." The door swung open, and a bearded man in a miner's outfit emerged first, followed by a portly gentleman in an ill-fitting suit. Then a gloved hand appeared, and the entire atmosphere of Dry Creek, Wyoming Territory seemed to shift on its axis. She stepped down with surprising grace for someone who'd endured 3 days of rough travel. 20 years old, with rich chestnut hair pinned beneath a modest bonnet, she wore a traveling dress of deep blue that somehow remained remarkably unwrinkled. Her face, when she turned toward the sunlight, stole the breath from Dillon's lungs, not just for its undeniable beauty, but for its determination. This was no wilting flower, but a woman with purpose in her green eyes and resolve in the set of her shoulders. "Miss Delilah Harrington," the stage driver announced, handing down her carpetbag. "All the way from Boston, if you can believe it." Boston? Dillon almost laughed at the absurdity. Eastern women who ventured west typically lasted weeks, not months, before the harsh realities sent them scurrying back to civilization. This one would be no different. Sheriff Holloway stepped forward. "Miss Harrington, welcome to Dry Creek. Your telegram mentioned you're our new schoolteacher." "That's correct, Sheriff," she replied, and her voice carried clearly across the depot. "I understand the position has been vacant for some time." 2 years, the sheriff admitted. "Not many willing to teach in a place like this." She smiled, revealing a quiet confidence that seemed misplaced for someone so clearly out of her element. "Then I arrived just in time." Dillon shook his head slightly. She'd learned soon enough that Dry Creek wasn't built for dreams or ambitions. It was a place for survival, nothing more. Still, he couldn't deny a flicker of curiosity about what would drive a clearly educated Boston woman to the Wyoming Territory, especially one so young and... His mind stumbled over the word beautiful before he forced it aside. The sheriff was explaining something about the schoolhouse when the woman's gaze caught Dillon's. For a moment, neither looked away. Something passed between them, a recognition perhaps, though of what Dillon couldn't say. He tipped his hat slightly, more reflex than gesture, and turned to leave. "Excuse me," her voice called after him. "Might you be hiring?" Dillon turned back, confusion evident on his face. "Ma'am." The gentleman at the livery mentioned a rancher was looking for help with a cattle drive. Her direct gaze challenged him to dismiss her. "That would be me," Dillon said cautiously, "but I need experienced hands who can manage cattle and rough country." I see, she said undeterred, and your schoolchildren. Do you need someone who can teach them while their fathers are away on your drive? The question caught him off guard. Several of the men he hoped to hire did indeed have children of school age, and keeping them in town would mean the men couldn't join the drive. It was a problem he hadn't considered. The school term starts when? He asked. When I say it does, she answered with surprising authority. If having the children occupied would help secure your workforce, I'm amenable to coordinating my schedule. Dillon studied her more carefully. Beneath the proper Boston exterior was something he hadn't expected: pragmatism. Most teachers don't arrive looking to negotiate with ranchers, he observed. Most teachers haven't traveled 2,000 miles to build something meaningful. Her smile remained, but her eyes conveyed seriousness. I believe in practical education, Mr. Matthews. Dillon Matthews. Mr. Matthews, if your drive means income for local families, then helping ensure its success falls within my educational mission. Something stirred in Dillon that he didn't care to examine too closely. That's resourceful thinking, Miss Harrington. Necessary thinking in a place like this, she corrected him. Now, if you'll excuse me, I should get settled before meeting with the town council. As she walked away with the sheriff, Dillon found himself watching her longer than he intended. A peculiar woman, certainly, but she'd be gone by winter, they always were. The West broke Eastern dreams with methodical indifference. Still, as he mounted his horse and rode toward his ranch, he couldn't shake the feeling that Delilah Harrington might prove more resilient than most. 2 weeks passed before Dillon returned to town, his ranch duties keeping him from making the 10-mile journey more frequently. Spring preparations demanded his full attention, mending fences, branding calves, and breaking new horses. Yet thoughts of the unusual schoolteacher had infiltrated his mind during quiet moments, much to his irritation. He told himself his interest was purely practical. She had, after all, opened the schoolhouse a full month early to accommodate the children of his hired hands. The arrangement had worked exactly as she'd proposed, allowing him to secure 4 experienced cowboys for the upcoming drive. That was all a mutually beneficial business arrangement. When he finally rode into Dry Creek on a Saturday afternoon, he was surprised to find the normally sleepy town buzzing with activity. Children raced across the street carrying armfuls of books, while several women gathered outside the general store in animated conversation. Tying his horse outside the mercantile, Dillon nodded to Mrs. Parker, the proprietor's wife. Town seems lively today. The older woman smiled knowingly. That new teacher's got everyone stirred up. Convinced Mr. Hammond to donate lumber for proper desks, organized the ladies to sew new curtains for the schoolhouse, even got the Peterson boys interested in reading, and Lord knows their father tried for years with no success. Dillon raised an eyebrow. Accomplished a lot in 2 weeks. She's a force of nature, that one, Mrs. Parker agreed. Though some folks are already complaining she's too progressive, teaching girls mathematics alongside the boys, if you can imagine. Despite himself, Dillon felt a smile tug at his lips. Sounds like she's ruffling feathers. Some feathers needed ruffling. This town's been stuck in its ways too long. Mrs. Parker lowered her voice. Between us, it's about time someone brought some life to Dry Creek. As if summoned by their conversation, Delilah Harrington appeared at the corner, surrounded by a group of children. She wore a simple dove-gray dress with a white collar, her chestnut hair pulled back in a practical style that somehow enhanced rather than diminished her natural beauty. She was demonstrating something with a compass, pointing toward the mountains in the distance. And that's how settlers navigate when there are no roads to follow, she was explaining. Using the sun, stars, and basic instruments, people found their way across this entire continent. A small boy raised his hand. Is that how you found Wyoming, Miss Harrington? She laughed, the sound carrying across the street. No, Tommy, I had the luxury of the railroad for most of my journey, but my father taught me these skills during our expeditions in Massachusetts. Was your pa an explorer? Another child asked, a brief shadow crossed her face. A naturalist, he believed education happened best outside classroom walls. Dillon found himself moving closer, drawn by her animated teaching style. When she spotted him, she offered a nod of recognition, but continued her impromptu lesson without interruption. Only when the children had been dismissed with an assignment to create their own simple compasses did she approach him. Mr. Matthews, she greeted him, I trust your preparations are going well. The children tell me you'll be leaving for Cheyenne soon. 2 weeks from Monday, he confirmed. Your arrangement's been helpful. The men appreciate being able to earn the drive wages, knowing their children are looked after. Excellent, I've been incorporating practical mathematics using cattle prices and distance calculations. The children seem quite engaged when the examples relate to their families' livelihoods. Dillon studied her with new curiosity. Not many Boston teachers would understand the value of that. Perhaps because not many Boston teachers had fathers who believed learning should serve practical ends. She adjusted her shawl against the spring breeze. Besides, I'm not in Boston anymore. That's apparent, he replied, though I admit you're adapting better than I expected. Her eyebrow arched slightly. Did you expect me to flee back east at the first sign of difficulty, Mr. Matthews? Most do, he said bluntly. This territory breaks more dreams than it fulfills. Is that what happened to yours? The directness of her question caught him off guard. I never had dreams to break, he answered. Just goals to achieve. Survival isn't about dreams. What a remarkably empty philosophy, she observed, not unkindly. Is survival truly enough for you? Before he could formulate a response, the general store owner called out to her. Miss Harrington, those books you ordered have arrived on today's freight wagon. Her face brightened immediately. Please excuse me, Mr. Matthews. Those science texts have been desperately needed. As she walked away, Dillon was left with the uncomfortable sensation of having been seen through. Delilah Harrington didn't just look at a person, she seemed to read them like one of her precious books. The thought was unsettling. More unsettling was the realization that part of him wanted to continue their conversation. The following week brought unseasonable storms that flooded creek beds and delayed Dillon's final preparations for the cattle drive. Working from dawn until well after dusk, he and his hired hands struggled to prevent the spring calves from being swept away by flash floods. By Thursday, exhaustion had settled deep in his bones, but the worst of the crisis had passed. As he rode back to his cabin that evening, the rain finally relented, giving way to an eerie calm. The last pink light of sunset broke through the clouds, illuminating the sodden landscape. He was still a mile from home when he spotted a wagon mired in mud near the creek crossing, its lone occupant struggling to free a wheel from the muck. Drawing closer, he was startled to recognize Delilah Harrington, her skirts mud-spattered, and her usually immaculate hair falling loose around her shoulders as she leveraged a branch beneath the wheel. Miss Harrington, he called, guiding his horse through the mud, what in heaven's name are you doing out here? She straightened, pushing damp hair from her face. Mr. Matthews, fortuitous timing. The Turner family lives beyond the creek and young Alice has been ill. I've brought medicine from town, but as you can see, she gestured to the hopelessly stuck wagon. Dillon dismounted, assessing the situation with a practiced eye. Creek's running too high to cross anyway. Wagon would be swept downstream even if we freed it. Then I'll go on foot, she declared, reaching for her medical bag. That's 8 miles of rough country, he said incredulously, and you'd have to cross the creek at its widest point. Alice Turner has pneumonia. This medicine can't wait until the waters recede. The determination in her voice matched the set of her jaw. Dillon recognized the futility of arguing. You can't go alone. My ranch is half a mile ahead. We'll get fresh horses and cross at the high bridge. Relief softened her features. Thank you. I was beginning to fear I'd made a terrible miscalculation. The Turners' homestead is isolated even in good weather, he said, helping her collect her belongings from the wagon. What possessed you to attempt this journey alone? Doctor Simmons is attending a birth at the Sullivan Ranch, she explained, securing her medical bag. When he couldn't go himself, he prepared the medicine and asked if anyone could deliver it. No one else volunteered. So naturally you took it upon yourself, Dillon said with a hint of exasperation, helping her mount his horse before swinging up behind her. The unexpected proximity was immediately discomfiting. Her back pressed against his chest, and the scent of lavender mingled with rain filled his senses. He maintained as much distance as the saddle allowed, which wasn't nearly enough. I don't take foolish risks, Mr. Matthews, she said as they rode toward his ranch, but I won't stand idle when action is required. Even if that action could get you killed, flash floods have taken experienced frontiersmen in these parts. Even then, she said simply, some things are worth the risk. At his ranch, they transferred to fresh horses. Dillon quickly packed provisions, extra blankets, and his rifle before they set out toward the high bridge, a narrow wooden structure spanning a deep gorge 3 miles upstream. Darkness had fallen completely by the time they reached the bridge. The creek below had become a roaring torrent, its angry voice echoing against the canyon walls. Dillon dismounted to test the bridge's stability with his lantern held high. "It's been damaged," he called back to her, "but it should hold if we cross one at a time, leading the horses." "You go first," she suggested. "Then if there's any weakness, you'll be able to warn me." Dillon paused, struck by her calm logic in the face of danger. He'd known hardened cowboys who'd panic at the prospect of crossing a damaged bridge over floodwaters. Yet this Boston schoolteacher stood ready, her face composed in the lantern light. He crossed carefully, testing each step, and reached the other side without incident. "Come across," he called against the water's roar. "Slowly, just as I did." Delilah began her crossing, leading her horse with steady hands. She had traversed half the distance when a terrible groaning sound rose above the water's fury. A support beam, weakened by the flood, gave way beneath her. The bridge tilted sharply. Her horse whinnied in terror, rearing back and breaking free of her grip. As the animal bolted back towards safety, Delilah lost her footing and fell hard against the bridge railing. "Hold on," Dillon shouted, dropping his gear and rushing back onto the failing structure. The entire bridge swayed beneath his weight as he fought his way toward her. Delilah had managed to grip the railing with both hands, her body dangling precariously over the churning waters below. The medical bag remained miraculously slung across her body. "Give me your hand." Dillon reached for her, stretching out as far as he dared while maintaining his own grip on the more stable section of railing. Their fingers touched, slipped, then caught. With a strength born of desperation, Dillon pulled her up until she could secure her footing on the tilted planking. Together they inched back toward the far bank, the bridge groaning ominously beneath them. They had nearly reached safety when the final supports gave way. With a mighty leap, Dillon propelled them both toward solid ground as the bridge collapsed into the gorge behind them. They landed hard, rolling through mud and scrub brush before coming to rest several feet from the edge. For several moments they lay there catching their breath, the reality of their narrow escape sinking in. Dillon was acutely aware of Delilah beside him, her breathing ragged but steadying. "Are you hurt?" he finally asked. "Nothing serious," she answered, sitting up gingerly. "The medicine survived as well." She patted the bag still strapped across her body. "Your horse is gone," Dillon said, helping her to her feet. "And we're now on the wrong side of the creek." "But the right side for reaching the Turners," she pointed out pragmatically. "How much farther?" Dillon stared at her in disbelief. "You nearly died and you're still determined to continue." "Alice Turner could be dying, Mr. Matthews. Has nearly drowning changed that fact?" Her steady gaze challenged him. A reluctant admiration stirred within him. "4 more miles," he conceded. "We'll share my horse, but at first light I'm taking you straight back to town." "After we've delivered the medicine," she agreed. They rode in silence through the darkness, Delilah seated before him this time so he could better control the horse on the treacherous terrain. Despite his efforts to maintain propriety, the journey necessitated a closeness that was increasingly difficult to ignore. When she leaned against him as fatigue overtook her, Dillon found himself unconsciously adjusting to support her weight. The Turner cabin appeared just before midnight, a single lantern burning in its window. The family's relief at their arrival was palpable. Alice, a girl of perhaps 8 years, lay fevered on a straw mattress, her breathing labored and her small face flushed. While Delilah administered the medicine and showed Mrs. Turner how to continue treatment, Mr. Turner offered Dillon hot coffee and dry blankets. "God sent you both tonight," the weathered farmer said solemnly. "Doc Simmons wasn't sure Alice would last another day without the medicine." "It was Miss Harrington's determination that got us here," Dillon responded truthfully. "I just provided the horse." "And saved my life when the bridge collapsed," Delilah added, joining them by the fire. "Alice is resting more comfortably now. The fever should break by morning if we continue the treatment through the night." They spent the night at the Turner cabin, Dillon dozing in a chair while Delilah helped Mrs. Turner tend to Alice. By dawn, the girl's fever had indeed broken, and she managed to take some broth, the first nourishment she'd accepted in days. As they prepared to depart, Mrs. Turner embraced Delilah with tears in her eyes. "We've no way to repay what you've done." "Seeing Alice recover is payment enough," Delilah responded, and the sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. They rode back toward town as morning light spread across the sodden landscape. The creek remained impassable at the normal crossing, forcing them to take a longer route that would add hours to their journey. "You should have been a doctor, not a schoolteacher," Dillon observed as they rode. "You've got a natural instinct for healing." "I considered it," she admitted, "but education builds the foundation for everything else. A doctor treats illness, a teacher prevents ignorance that leads to countless sufferings." "Is that why you came to Wyoming?" To prevent suffering through education, there was genuine curiosity in his question. She was quiet for a moment before responding. "Partly, but I also came because I needed to prove something to myself." "What's that?" "That I could build something meaningful on my own terms." She glanced back at him. "My father died last year. He believed women were capable of extraordinary things if given freedom and education. Not everyone in Boston agreed with his progressive views." "So you came to the frontier to prove him right." Dillon was beginning to understand her better. "To honor his belief in me," she corrected gently. "And perhaps to discover if I truly am as capable as he always insisted." "After last night, I'd say that question is answered," Dillon said. The words emerged more softly than he'd intended. She turned slightly in the saddle to study his face. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Matthews." "How so?" "You present yourself as a man concerned solely with survival, yet you risked your life for a schoolteacher delivering medicine to a child you barely know." Dillon shifted uncomfortably. "Any decent man would have done the same." "Perhaps," she allowed, "but you did it without hesitation. That suggests there's more beneath your carefully maintained exterior than mere survival instinct." He had no ready response to that observation. They rode on in silence as the morning sun climbed higher, drying the mud-soaked landscape and warming their rain-chilled bodies. By mid-afternoon, they reached the outskirts of Dry Creek. Dillon had expected to feel relief at returning Delilah safely to town, at ending this unexpected detour from his carefully ordered existence. Instead, he felt a curious reluctance as they approached the schoolhouse where she both taught and lived in the small attached quarters. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Matthews," she said formally as he helped her dismount. "I apologize for disrupting your preparations." "No apology needed," he replied. "The Turner girl is alive because of your determination." "And your courage," she added. Their eyes met briefly before she looked away. "When does your cattle drive depart?" 4 days, he answered. "Weather permitting." She nodded, gathering her mudded skirts. "Then I wish you safe travels. The children will miss their fathers, but they understand the importance of your work." As she turned to go, Dillon found himself speaking without forethought. "Miss Harrington, Delilah, would you allow me to call on you properly when I return from Cheyenne?" The question seemed to surprise them both. A faint color rose in her cheeks as she regarded him with those perceptive green eyes. "I would welcome that, Mr. Matthews." "Dillon," he corrected. "Dillon," she repeated with a small smile before disappearing into the schoolhouse. As he rode toward his ranch, Dillon puzzled over his impulsive invitation. Attachment was dangerous in this unforgiving land. He'd learned that lesson through blood and loss. Yet something about Delilah Harrington challenged his most fundamental beliefs about life on the frontier. Perhaps, he reflected, there were some risks worth taking after all. The weeks of the cattle drive stretched Dillon's endurance to its limits. Spring rains continued intermittently, turning sections of the trail to treacherous mud that slowed their progress and frayed tempers. A broken wagon axle cost them 2 days. When a mountain lion spooked the herd one night, causing a small stampede, Dillon worked alongside his men for 20 hours straight to recover the scattered cattle. Through it all, unbidden thoughts of Delilah Harrington surfaced at odd moments. He caught himself wondering what she would make of a particularly spectacular sunset, or how she might approach a problem that had the men baffled. Once, while riding Point, he realized he'd been composing a letter to her in his mind, an exercise in futility, as they were far from any post station. "Getting soft in your old age," he muttered to himself, earning a curious look from his nearest ranch hand. By the time they reached Cheyenne, the drive had taken nearly 3 weeks instead of the anticipated 2. The delay chafed at Dillon, though he couldn't have explained precisely why returning to Dry Creek had suddenly become so urgent. Fortunately, cattle prices were higher than expected, turning what might have been a merely profitable venture into a surprisingly lucrative one. After paying his hands their bonuses and purchasing much-needed supplies, Dillon found himself with enough funds to finally expand his small ranch house and possibly increase his herd significantly. The return journey passed more quickly, with empty wagons and lighter spirits making for better time. As they crossed back into familiar territory, Dillon found his thoughts increasingly occupied with what awaited him in Dry Creek, or more specifically, at the schoolhouse. What exactly did he intend by calling on Delilah? The question troubled him more than he cared to admit. His life had been carefully constructed around independence and self-reliance. Emotional entanglements had no place in that framework. Yet the memory of her steady courage during their nighttime journey to the Turners' homestead and the surprising comfort of her presence beside him had somehow undermined certainties he'd held since his father's death. They arrived back in Dry Creek on a Sunday afternoon in early June. The town appeared unusually active, with numerous wagons and horses lining the main street. Dillon and his men exchanged puzzled glances as they rode past the crowded church. Some kind of special service, one of the hands wondered aloud. The mystery was solved when they reached the town square, where tables had been arranged in a broad circle. A hand-painted banner proclaimed Dry Creek Literary Society and Community Picnic. Literary Society, Dillon's foreman chuckled. In Dry Creek, now I've seen everything. Curious despite his fatigue, Dillon dismissed his men to their well-earned rest and rode closer to investigate. The gathering included nearly everyone in town, from the wealthiest merchants to the poorest farmers. Children raced between tables laden with food, while adults engaged in what appeared to be earnest discussion over open books. At the center of it all, unsurprisingly, stood Delilah. She wore a simple dress of sage green that complemented her eyes, her chestnut hair styled more elaborately than he'd seen before. She was reading aloud from a leather-bound volume, her audience hanging on every word. As if sensing his presence, she glanced up and met his gaze across the square. A smile of genuine pleasure illuminated her face, causing something in Dillon's chest to tighten inexplicably. She finished her reading before making her way through the crowd toward him. "You've returned safely," she greeted him. "The children will be pleased. They've been tracking your journey on our map, estimating your progress based on typical cattle drive speeds." "We were delayed," he said, suddenly conscious of his trail-worn appearance. "The conditions were challenging." "But successful, I hope." There was genuine interest in her question. "Very," he confirmed. "What's all this?" He gestured toward the gathering. "Our first community literary picnic," she explained with evident pride. "We've established a lending library in the back of the schoolhouse and formed discussion groups for different interests: practical science for the farmers, literature for those seeking broader horizons, and special readings for the children." "In just 6 weeks," Dillon remarked, impressed despite himself. "People hunger for connection and knowledge, Mr. Matthews." "Dillon," she corrected herself, "even in a place that prides itself on rugged independence." Before he could respond, several townspeople approached to welcome him back and share news of developments during his absence. Delilah was called away to adjudicate some question about the lending library system. By the time they both extricated themselves from their respective conversations, the afternoon was waning. "I should go," Dillon said reluctantly. "I've been on the trail for weeks and must look like I've been dragged behind my horse." "Would you consider joining us once you've had a chance to rest?" Delilah asked. "The picnic continues until sunset, and your insights on the cattle markets would interest our economics discussion group." The invitation was so unlike anything he'd encountered in Dry Creek. Before that, Dillon found himself nodding agreement before he'd fully considered the implications. 2 hours later, having bathed, shaved, and changed into his one decent shirt, Dillon returned to find the gathering still in full swing. He felt oddly self-conscious as he approached, aware that his usual interactions in town were limited to business transactions and brief acknowledgments. Delilah spotted him immediately and waved him toward a table where several of the town's businessmen were engaged in animated discussion. "Gentlemen, Mr. Matthews has just returned from Cheyenne with fresh intelligence on the cattle markets." To Dillon's surprise, the next hour passed pleasantly as he shared his observations on price fluctuations and market demands. The merchants asked thoughtful questions that revealed genuine interest in understanding the economic forces affecting their community. As the conversation eventually turned to other topics, Dillon found an opportunity to speak privately with Delilah. "You've transformed this town in less than 2 months," he observed, watching as Mrs. Parker, normally reserved to the point of reclusiveness, laughed openly with a group of women discussing a novel. "I've merely provided some structure for what was already here," Delilah demurred. "These people have always had thoughts and dreams. they simply needed permission to express them. Permission isn't typically something frontier folk require, Dillon said. Perhaps not for survival, she agreed, but for thriving, that's different. People need to believe that beauty, knowledge, and connection are possible even in harsh places, especially in harsh places. Her words struck uncomfortably close to beliefs Dillon had abandoned long ago. Some might say focusing on such things diverts attention from necessary vigilance. Is that what you believe? She asked directly. Dillon considered the question more carefully than he might have before knowing her. I believed it, he admitted finally. Now I'm less certain. She smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes and caused that same peculiar tightening in his chest. Uncertainty can be the beginning of wisdom, or so my father always claimed. As the sun began to set, the gathering gradually dispersed. Without conscious decision, Dillon found himself offering to walk Delilah back to the schoolhouse. They strolled through the golden evening light, their conversation flowing more easily than he would have expected after weeks apart. I meant what I said before leaving, Dillon said as they reached her door. I would like to call on you properly, if you're amenable. In the fading light, her eyes seemed to search his face for something. I am, she said finally, though I admit to some confusion about your intentions. Her directness caught him off guard. My intentions? You've made it quite clear that you believe emotional attachments are dangerous distractions on the frontier, she said gently. Yet here you are, seemingly pursuing precisely such an attachment. I simply wonder what's changed. The question deserved honesty, however uncomfortable. I'm not entirely sure, he admitted, but I find myself thinking about you at the most inconvenient moments. During the cattle drive, I caught myself wondering what you would make of things I saw, conversations I had. He paused, searching for the right words. It's unsettling. Unsettling, she repeated with a small smile. Not the most flattering description I've received, but perhaps one of the most honest. I don't mean, he began, but she raised a hand to stop him. I understand, Dillon, truly, her expression softened. Change is always unsettling, especially when it challenges our most fundamental beliefs about how we should live. Standing there in the twilight, Dillon was struck by how completely this woman seemed to understand the conflict within him, perhaps better than he understood it himself. Would Friday evening be acceptable, he asked finally, for dinner at the hotel restaurant? Friday would be lovely, she agreed, though I should warn you half the town will be watching and drawing conclusions. Let them, Dillon said, surprising himself with the sentiment. Good night, Delilah. Good night, Dillon's. As he walked back toward his rented room at the boarding house, Dillon reflected that for the first time since arriving in Wyoming Territory 5 years earlier, Dry Creek no longer felt like merely a place of business and necessity. Something had shifted, not just in the town itself, but in his perception of what was possible here. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. By early July, Dillon's courtship of Delilah Harrington had become the primary topic of conversation throughout Dry Creek. Their Friday dinners at the hotel restaurant had expanded to include Sunday afternoon rides, attendance at community events Dillon would previously have avoided, and occasional private picnics in the meadow behind the schoolhouse. For Dillon, each encounter was both revelation and challenge. Delilah's intelligence and compassion continued to impress him, but more unsettling was how her presence had begun to reshape his understanding of his own life. Solitude, once comfortable and necessary, now felt empty when prolonged. The ranch, once merely a business enterprise, had begun to feel like a home he might someday share. These thoughts troubled him even as they excited a part of his spirit he'd long suppressed. His father's fate remained a powerful warning about the dangers of emotional vulnerability in the unforgiving West. On a particularly warm Saturday, Dillon invited Delilah to see the improvements he'd made to his ranch using the profits from the cattle drive. He had expanded the main house, adding a proper kitchen and a second bedroom, and constructed a new barn that allowed for increased hay storage. It's coming along nicely, Delilah observed as he showed her the newly planted vegetable garden, though I'm surprised you've put so much effort into domestic comforts for a bachelor. A man gets tired of eating beans directly from the pot, he said lightly, though they both recognized the inadequacy of the explanation. They settled on the front porch with lemonade, looking out across the valley where Dillon's small but growing herd grazed peacefully. The distant mountains provided a dramatic backdrop against the clear blue sky. It's beautiful here, Delilah said after a comfortable silence. I can see why you chose this land. The water rights make it valuable, Dillon explained, defaulting to practicality. The creek never runs dry, even in August. She smiled at his response. Always the pragmatist, but surely you must sometimes simply appreciate the beauty of what you've built. The question made him uncomfortable in its accuracy. Beauty isn't what keeps a man alive out here. No, she agreed, but it might be what makes survival worthwhile. They were interrupted by the arrival of Dillon's foreman, riding hard up the path to the house. The man's expression immediately put Dillon on alert. "Trouble, sir," the foreman called as he dismounted. "Just got word from town. There's a man asking questions about you, a hard case by the look of him." "What kind of questions?" Dillon asked, setting down his glass. "Wanting to know your routine when you come to town, whether you live alone." The foreman glanced apologetically at Delilah. "Pardon, ma'am." Did he give a name? Dillon's voice had taken on an edge Delilah hadn't heard before. "Calls himself Reed, said he has business with you from Texas." The color drained from Dillon's face. How long ago? "Not an hour, sheriff's watching him, but the man hasn't broken any laws yet." Dillon turned to Delilah, his expression now carefully composed. "I need to get you back to town immediately." "What's happening?" she asked, rising to her feet. "An old problem that needs addressing," he answered vaguely. "I'll explain later, but right now your safety is my priority." The ride back to Dry Creek passed in tense silence. Dillon's entire demeanor had transformed, his earlier warmth replaced by a vigilant wariness that reminded Delilah of their first meeting. He scanned the horizon constantly, one hand never far from his revolver. When they reached the schoolhouse, he dismounted quickly to help her down. "Stay inside until you hear from me or the sheriff," he instructed. "This man, Reed, he's dangerous." "Dillon," she caught his arm as he turned to leave. "Whatever this is, please be careful." Something flickered across his face, regret perhaps, or resignation. "I'm sorry, Delilah, I should have known the past always catches up eventually." He hesitated, then leaned down to place a brief, gentle kiss on her lips, their first. "Just in case," he murmured before mounting and riding toward the sheriff's office. Delilah watched him go, a sense of foreboding settling over her like a physical weight. Despite Dillon's instructions, she found herself unable to simply wait passively for news. After changing into more practical clothing, she made her way to Mrs. Parker's home adjacent to the general store, knowing the woman's husband would have the latest information. "He's some bounty hunter or hired gun, Mrs. Parker confirmed after inviting Delilah inside. George overheard him talking at the saloon, something about settling a debt from Texas years back. "Has there been any confrontation?" Delilah asked anxiously. "Not yet. Sheriff's keeping them separated for now. Dillon's at the office, and this Reed character is still drinking at the saloon." As darkness fell over Dry Creek, tension mounted throughout the small town. Residents hurried to complete their business and return home. Doors were locked unusually early, and an unnatural quiet descended on the normally peaceful evening. From Mrs. Parker's window, Delilah could see the sheriff's office and the saloon on opposite ends of the main street, like opposing forces preparing for inevitable collision. When Dillon finally emerged from the sheriff's office around 9 o'clock, she pressed her hand against the glass involuntarily. He stood for a moment on the boardwalk, adjusting his gun belt and speaking briefly to the sheriff. Even from a distance, Delilah could see the resolve in his stance. This was a different Dillon than the one who had kissed her just hours earlier. This was a man preparing to face something he'd long expected. As he began walking toward the saloon, Delilah made a decision. Ignoring Mrs. Parker's protests, she slipped out the back door and circled around behind the buildings, making her way toward the sheriff's office. Sheriff Holloway looked up in surprise when she entered. "Miss Harrington, you shouldn't be out tonight." "What's happening, Sheriff?" she demanded. "Who is this Reed, and what does he want with Dillon?" The sheriff sighed heavily. "It's not my story to tell, but since you're clearly involved with Matthews now," he gestured for her to sit. "Before coming to Wyoming, Dillon worked as a ranch hand in Texas. There was trouble, the details are sketchy, but it involved the ranch owner's son, a man named Victor Reeves." "Reeves, not Reed," Delilah noted. "Man's traveling under an alias, which tells you something about his intentions," the sheriff confirmed. From what little Dillon's shared, this Victor was a cruel sort who mistreated both animals and workers. There was an altercation that ended with Victor badly injured and threatening revenge. And now he's found Dillon, Delilah concluded. Appears so. Dillon wants to handle this himself, says it's his responsibility. I've agreed to stay out of it unless shots are fired. A commotion from the street interrupted their conversation. Raised voices carried through the night air, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. Stay here, the sheriff ordered, checking his revolver before hurrying outside. Delilah waited precisely 10 seconds before following. The scene on the main street had transformed into something from a dime novel. The saloon's batwing doors had been flung open, spilling yellow lamplight onto the dusty street. Two men faced each other in that pool of light, Dillon, standing tall and composed, and a heavily built stranger with a patchwork of scars across one side of his face. 5 years I've been looking for you, Matthews, the scarred man was saying, his voice carrying in the night air. 5 years tracking you across 3 territories. I figured you'd find me eventually, Victor, Dillon replied evenly. Though you seem to have had some trouble along the way, he gestured toward the man's scarred face. Victor Reeves spat into the dirt. Compliments of a Comanche raiding party, but this ain't about me. This is about you leaving me for dead and stealing my father's money. A murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered at a safe distance. Delilah felt her heart sink at the accusation. You know that's not what happened, Dillon said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. Your father paid me what he owed before I left. As for leaving you for dead, you pulled a knife on an unarmed man who called you out for whipping a horse to death. What happened next was self-defense. My father believed your lies, I didn't. Victor's hand hovered near his gun. Now it's time to settle accounts. Sheriff Holloway stepped forward. This is my town, gentlemen, we don't need bloodshed here. Stay out of this, Sheriff, Victor snarled. This is personal business. All business in Dry Creek is my business, the sheriff countered. Matthews is a respected rancher here. Whatever happened in Texas is in the past. Not for me, Victor insisted. Not while he's still breathing. Delilah pushed her way through the crowd until she stood at the edge of the confrontation. Dillon saw her and his expression tightened. Get back, Delilah, he called, never taking his eyes off Victor. Victor's attention shifted momentarily. Well now, what's this? The great loner Dillon Matthews has found himself a woman. A cruel smile twisted his scarred face. Interesting development. She's not part of this, Dillon said sharply. Everything about you is part of this, Victor countered. Maybe I should start with her, make you watch before. He never finished the sentence. At the implied threat to Delilah, something in Dillon snapped. Moving with unexpected speed, he closed the distance between them and struck Victor with a powerful right hook that sent the larger man stumbling backward. Victor recovered quickly, drawing his gun as he regained his balance. Dillon's own weapon cleared its holster a split second later. For a breathless moment, both men stood with revolvers aimed at each other's hearts. This isn't Texas, Dillon said quietly. I've built something here. I'm not the same man you knew. You're a thief and a coward, Victor spat back. Nothing changes that. I never stole from your father. He paid me my wages and gave me a bonus to leave quietly after what happened between us. He knew what kind of man you were, Victor. He was trying to protect you from yourself. Liar, Victor's finger tightened on the trigger. I have the letter, Dillon said suddenly. Your father's letter explaining everything. It's in my saddlebag. Sheriff can retrieve it. Doubt flickered across Victor's scarred face. You're bluffing. Check for yourself, Dillon nodded toward his horse tethered nearby, inside pocket of the right saddlebag. Your father's signature and seal. The sheriff moved carefully toward the horse. I'm just going to look nice and slow. The tension stretched unbearably as Sheriff Holloway searched the saddlebag. When he straightened, he held an envelope sealed with red wax. It's here, he confirmed, addressed to whom it may concern and sealed with what looks like the Reeves Ranch mark. Victor's gun wavered slightly. Read it. The sheriff broke the seal and unfolded the letter. To whom it may concern, he read aloud. I, Samuel Reeves, hereby confirm that Dillon Matthews left my employment on good terms and with full payment of all wages owed. Furthermore, I provided him with an additional sum of $500 as compensation for injuries sustained, while protecting my property from willful destruction. My son Victor's claims to the contrary are false and motivated by personal vendetta. Signed, Samuel Reeves, Circle R Ranch, Texas. A heavy silence fell over the street as the sheriff folded the letter and handed it to Victor. The scarred man scanned the document, his expression cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally a bitter resignation. "My father always did think more of his hired hands than his own son," Victor said flatly. "He was a good man trying to do right by everyone," Dillon responded, "including you, though you never saw it." Victor's gun remained pointed at Dillon's chest, but something had changed in his posture. "5 years I've been chasing you," he said, almost to himself. 5 years believing you'd stolen everything from me. "The only thing I took was my life and the wages I'd earned," Dillon said. "It's over, Victor, your father wouldn't want this." For a terrible moment, it seemed Victor might pull the trigger regardless. Then with a sound somewhere between a curse and a sob, he lowered his weapon. "Get out of my town," Sheriff Holloway said firmly, stepping forward to take Victor's gun. "First stage leaves at dawn." "Be on it." As the sheriff escorted Victor away, the tension broke like a thunderclap. The gathered townspeople began dispersing, voices rising in excited discussion of what they'd witnessed. Dillon remained motionless for several heartbeats before holstering his weapon with a slightly unsteady hand. Delilah moved toward him then, reaching him just as the last of his composure threatened to crumble. Without a word, she took his arm and led him away from the curious eyes and speculation, guiding him toward the schoolhouse. Inside, she lit a lamp and gestured for him to sit while she prepared tea. Neither spoke until the simple domestic ritual was complete and steaming cups sat before them. "You kept that letter all these years," she finally observed. "You expected him to find you eventually." Dillon nodded, his hands wrapped around the cup as though seeking its warmth. "I knew Victor wouldn't give up, his pride wouldn't allow it, so I carried the proof with me always." "Why not simply show the sheriff when you first arrived in Dry Creek? Establish the truth from the beginning. And be known forever as the man who was running from something," Dillon shook his head. "I wanted a fresh start, not to bring old troubles with me." "Yet you were always waiting for those troubles to find you anyway," she said softly. "Is that why you've kept everyone at a distance, why you convinced yourself that attachments were dangerous?" The directness of her insight struck him like a physical blow. "I couldn't risk involving anyone else when I knew Victor might appear any day. It wouldn't have been fair." "So you chose isolation as a form of protection, for others as much as for yourself," Delilah concluded. "That's why you reacted so strongly when he threatened me." "The thought of you being hurt because of my past," Dillon's voice trailed off, the magnitude of his fear still evident in his expression. Delilah reached across the table to take his hand. "But now it's over. Victor knows the truth. Your name is cleared." "Yes," Dillon agreed, though he seemed unsure what to make of this new reality. "So what happens now?" she asked gently. "I don't know," he admitted. "For so long, my life has been shaped by looking over my shoulder, expecting the worst. I'm not sure I remember how to live any other way." "Perhaps you never really learned in the first place," Delilah suggested. "From what you've told me about losing your parents so young, and then this trouble in Texas, you've been in survival mode most of your life." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. "And you think there's another mode worth trying?" "I know there is," she said with quiet certainty. "I've seen glimpses of it in you already when you speak about your land, when you help the Turners without hesitation, even in how you've begun participating in town gatherings." "That's largely your influence," he pointed out. "Perhaps I've provided some encouragement," she acknowledged, "but the capacity was always within you, Dillon. You've just never felt safe enough to explore it." Safe, the word resonated in a way he hadn't expected. Safety had always meant physical security in his mind, protection from elements, predators, and men like Victor Reeves. The idea that emotional safety might be equally vital was revolutionary. "I should go," he said finally, rising from his chair. "It's been a long day." Delilah walked him to the door. "Will I see you tomorrow?" The question held more significance than its simple words suggested. It was really asking, now that your past no longer demands vigilance, what will you choose? Dillon looked down at this remarkable woman who had somehow slipped past defenses he'd maintained for years. "Yes," he said simply, "tomorrow." As he walked back to his rented room, Dillon felt as though a weight he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there had suddenly been lifted. The night sky seemed vaster, the stars brighter. For the first time since his father's death, he allowed himself to consider a future unconstrained by the past. It was terrifying, it was exhilarating, it felt like freedom. The weeks following Victor Reeves' departure marked a subtle but profound shift in Dillon's approach to life. The change wasn't immediately apparent to casual observers, but to those who knew him well, and increasingly that included much of Dry Creek, the transformation was unmistakable. He began attending town council meetings, offering practical suggestions for improvements to local roads and water management. He joined the Literary Society's discussion group focused on agricultural advancements, bringing books he'd ordered specifically to share with local farmers. Most tellingly, he started inviting neighbors to Sunday dinners at his ranch, gradually transforming his once-isolated homestead into a place of community and connection. Through it all, his relationship with Delilah deepened. Their courtship progressed from cautious exploration to confident partnership as summer ripened into early autumn. They complemented each other in ways neither had anticipated, her visionary idealism balanced by his practical resourcefulness, his self-reliance softened by her belief in community. On a crisp September evening, as they walked along the creek that ran through Dillon's property, he finally gave voice to thoughts that had been forming for months. "I've been thinking about the future," he began somewhat hesitantly, "about what I want my life to be now that I'm not constantly looking over my shoulder." "And what have you concluded?" Delilah asked, her hand comfortable in his. "That I want more than survival," he said simply. "I want to build something meaningful, not just a successful ranch, but a true home, a place of warmth and connection." "That sounds wonderful," she encouraged when he paused. "The thing is," he continued, stopping to face her directly, "I can't imagine that home without you in it." He took both her hands in his. "I know we've only known each other a few months, but I feel as though you've awakened something in me that I thought had died long ago, the capacity to hope, to trust, to—" He hesitated, then pushed forward, "to love." Delilah's eyes widened slightly, a blush coloring her cheeks in the golden evening light. "Dillon, please," he interrupted gently, "let me finish before my courage fails." Drawing a deep breath, he continued, "I love you, Delilah Harrington, your intelligence, your compassion, your remarkable courage. I love how you see beauty where others see only hardship, how you create community where isolation once prevailed. I love that you challenged every assumption I'd made about life on the frontier." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small wooden box. "I carved this myself," he explained somewhat self-consciously as he opened it to reveal a simple but elegant gold band. "It's not fancy like something from Boston, but—" "It's perfect," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. Dillon dropped to one knee, still holding her hand. "Delilah Harrington, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Will you help me transform a house into a home, a piece of land into a legacy?" For a long moment, Delilah simply looked at him, her expression so full of emotion that he couldn't read it clearly. Then she sank to her knees before him, bringing them face to face. "When I came to Wyoming," she said softly, "I was seeking purpose and independence. I wanted to prove that I could build something meaningful on my own terms, as my father had always believed I could." She touched his face gently. "What I never expected was to find a partner who would make that vision even richer and more fulfilling than I'd imagined." "Is that a yes?" Dillon asked, his heart pounding. "Yes," she confirmed with a radiant smile. "Yes, I will marry you, Dillon Matthews. I will help you build that home and that legacy, and we will create something beautiful together in this place that once seemed too harsh for dreams." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and drew her into a tender kiss, Dillon marveled at how completely his understanding of the frontier had transformed. What he had once seen as a land that demanded isolation for survival, he now recognized as a place that actually required connection and community to truly thrive. Their wedding in late October became a celebration not just of their union, but of the community Dry Creek was becoming. The entire town participated, transforming the small church and adjacent grounds into a festival of autumn splendor. Mrs. Parker organized a wedding feast that combined traditional fare with recipes from Delilah's Boston childhood. The newly formed town band provided music for dancing that continued well into the night. Standing beside his bride as they greeted their guests, Dillon was struck by how many connections they had formed. Farmers whose children had flourished under Delilah's teaching, merchants who had implemented his suggestions for improving trade routes, even grizzled cowboys who'd found unexpected pleasure in the Literary Society's practical science discussions, all had become part of their extended family. "Did you ever imagine this?" he asked softly as they took a moment alone between dances. "When you first stepped off that stagecoach, did you picture yourself marrying a Wyoming rancher 7 months later? Delilah laughed, the sound as clear and joyful as the first time he'd heard it. Not specifically, no. But I did come west seeking meaningful connection and purpose. I simply found it in a form I hadn't anticipated. As did I, he acknowledged, drawing her closer. I spent years believing the frontier was no place for love, that attachment was a luxury I couldn't afford. And now, she prompted, her eyes reflecting the light from the lanterns strung across the town square. Now I understand that love isn't a luxury here, it's a necessity. He brushed a gentle kiss across her forehead. The frontier isn't conquered by lone men with guns and grit. It's transformed by communities, by families, by people who care enough about each other to face its challenges together. As they rejoined the dancing, moving in perfect harmony through the steps of a Virginia reel, Dillon reflected on the journey that had brought them together. From a young man determined to survive alone to a husband eagerly anticipating the family they would create together, his transformation had been as dramatic as the Wyoming seasons. The town that had once seemed to lack romance had become the setting for the greatest love story he could imagine, not despite its harshness, but perhaps because of it. For it was in facing the frontier's challenges together that he and Delilah had discovered the depth of their connection and the strength of their partnership. The life they were building would never be easy, the Wyoming Territory would see to that. There would be harsh winters, summer droughts, economic uncertainties, and all the unpredictable trials of frontier existence. But where Dillon had once seen only threats to be endured alone, he now saw challenges to be met together, with a community at their backs and love as their foundation. As they whirled through the final dance of their wedding celebration, surrounded by the friends and neighbors who had become family, Dillon Matthews finally understood the truth that had eluded him for so long. The frontier didn't break dreams, it tested them. And those dreams strong enough to withstand its trials emerged more powerful and more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. In Delilah's brave heart, he had found not just love, but a new vision of what the West could be, not merely a place to survive, but a place to truly live with purpose and connection and joy. Together, they would write a new chapter in the story of Dry Creek, Wyoming Territory, a chapter filled with the romance that had once seemed impossible in this rugged land. And as they stepped into their future together, Dillon knew with absolute certainty that the brave woman who had captured this cowboy's heart had also given him something even more precious. A home where love would always flourish, no matter what challenges the frontier might bring.